So some time ago, maybe a couple of weeks ago, I was doing some reading online, some football research, and I came across an interesting tidbit of information. It was just a snippet on a very large online football fan community. When you spend a fair bit of time on these football communities, you start to get a feel for who knows certain things and who doesn't. And I kept this particular information away from True Eagle for a couple of reasons, I suppose. First of all, you can never absolutely verify that something's true that you read online. And second of all, there was a part of me that wanted to protect the sanctity of that online community rather than just going in, plucking things and then broadcasting them as though they're my own information. I don't want to do that. But I think we've hit a point where I can probably share what I read. So there was a suggestion that West Coast had an ideal scenario where they don't pick 3 to the draft this year. They were in fact planning or hoping to spend that pick on a more or less a top tier talent playing at another club. The target was unnamed at the time, but to my mind, there's only really a couple of options of who that could have been. And first of all, the Shea Bolton, who has requested a trade to Fremantle. So I thought maybe it's Shea. The other one that came to mind was Chad Warner. We're talking about top tier talents that have been linked to a move at some point in the past, and it helps that they're West Australian. So I thought that's probably the only other logical one, but there was no real indication as to whether or not either Shea Bolton or Chad Warner really wanted to play for West Coast. So I didn't really think too much more of it, although I kept it in the back of my mind, hoping something would pop up. And sure enough, today, I wake up and I see that Backchat, aka Will Schofield via the Shelter Footy Cast, has not only said something interesting in a podcast, they've actually titled it, "If Sydney win the flag, Chad Warner will go to West Coast." So now we've got 2 interesting pieces of information. What I'll do is I'll roll the clip where Schofield and Mark Reddings talk about it.
I think if you're Fremantle or West Coast, I think you should be going for Sydney, because I think
if they win, Warner thinks goodbye.
Premiership is to Sydney, Chad Warner comes to either of those clubs, and I think maybe West Coast. I think West Coast.
Smokey?
I think Sydney win the flag, Chad Warner goes to West Coast this year. I think they're preparing to make a run at Chad Warner before it gets too late, which next year will be. And I think there would be a certain desire from Chad Warner to make his way back over here, and I think a premiership gets it done. Doesn't win a flag, he'll stay.
You sound like you're not just talking, and because some of the stuff that comes out of your mouth, I can tell it's just like a thought bubble. This sounds like you got some information.
No, I don't know, Skeeter. I'm not a newsbreaker.
But you speak to people. Don't downplay. You got contacts, as I do. You think more West Coast than Freo do?
This year,
I suppose if Bolton is at Freo,
yes,
that leaves the door open to...
So I'll let you make up your own mind as to the validity of that. We shouldn't take everything that's said in that kind of nature as gospel, but it is an interesting second piece of supporting information to the first bit that I said, that West Coast have really got themselves knee deep in a chase for someone potentially like Chad Warner. Now, we know Scoey's well connected. We also know that those with whom he is connected know that he has a podcast, and I really have no idea to what extent he has information. I really don't think he's the sort of guy who would make things up to simply get clicks. My bottom line here being, I think there's actually something in this. Scoey said a few things. He more or less, I didn't see this at the time, but I believe he called the Jack Darlington North Melbourne thing well before it happened. He has been pretty big on Stephen King being the new coach of the West Coast Eagles. Now, that part we cannot verify yet. We know he is a contender, and a serious contender at that, and possibly even the favourite. Since then, it's emerged Skipworth is also being considered. That doesn't mean, Scoey's wrong. It may mean that, the plans at West Coast had changed. Apparently, the Skipworth interview went perhaps unexpectedly well, to paraphrase what I'd read. So there's a bit of form here. My gut feeling is that Will Schofield didn't just say this out of opinion. I think there is a good chance West Coast is really trying to get Chad Warner this offseason. And I suppose that the new, fresh, interesting information in this piece is a suggestion that Chad Warner would actually be willing to come play for West Coast. And I did note that he did lean, Scoey, he didn't rule out Fremantle, but he did lean towards West Coast being the target. So I think there's something in this. So rather than just want to fuel the fire of a potential trade rumor that could be nothing, perhaps I'll use this video as as an opportunity to discuss whether we think it's the right move. It's always exciting when a big A-grader, which Chad Warner is linked to your club, and it doesn't happen very often to West Coast. I think Tim Kelly's the biggest ever trade recruit we've ever had, and the other big trade recruits we've had have become stars at West Coast. The ones that come to mind are Josh Kennedy and Elliot Yeo. You know, they weren't high profile when they came to us. So this has some parallels to the Tim Kelly situation. So let's discuss whether this potential move for Chad Warner would be right for the West Coast Eagles. So let's call it what it is. Chad Warner is contracted for one more season at the Sydney Swans. Whether he's in contract or he's not, he is going to be expensive, and it only works against us. In this hypothetical scenario where this is real, it only works against us that he's contracted, and so this will cost a pretty penny. And I can understand why people's minds go immediately to the Tim Kelly situation and think, well, we kind of sold the farm for one single player and it didn't really work out. I do think contextually there are some important differences to the position we're in now to the position we were in 2019 when we decided to top up our list with Tim Kelly. While the Tim Kelly deal didn't work out, I do think that was probably more a case of not us misreading our list position. I think it made perfect sense to go for Tim Kelly, and it's going to take a lot for me to change my mind. It made perfect sense, and we rolled the dice, and it failed, but I think I would have been pretty dirty at the time had we let him go to Fremantle. We tried to keep the team good, and the arse fell out of this team. It's not time to get into that. But broadly speaking, you know, the circumstances and the list position of the team changed slowly at first, and then the arse fell out of the team from 2021 onward. Tim Kelly was also 26 at the time of being recruited, and he turned 27 in his first season. So an important distinction here is Chad Warner is, I believe, currently 23 years old, and next year in his hypothetical first season at West Coast, he would turn 24. So from an age profile point of view, he kind of ticks both boxes of improving us right now, but also still being, you know, part of our young talent. If you're 24 and under, you probably still count as young talent. There's also this strong argument, in my opinion, that getting a Chad Warner to partner up with a Harley Reid has numerous benefits, but, you know, it could also expedite the rebuild process and speed it up a little bit and mean it's not that far away that we start improving. So unlike the Kelly deal, the risk of us misreading where we're at as a list is pretty minimal. I mean, we know we're shit, and we know that our best footballers ahead of us. God, you'd hope so. Whereas with the Tim Kelly deal, you could say that we thought we'd had a little bit longer at the top, and for a variety of reasons that are not particularly related to Tim Kelly, we fell away. No matter what way you slice it, our list build is in front of us. We cannot get any worse. The risk that we face is that when we inevitably, hypothetically, trade a lot for Chad Warner, the biggest risk we face is him not being that good, which is true of any trade. And it's not invalid, but, you know, on face value, Chad Warner's had an unbelievable season. I'm recording this in the middle of the Brownlow count. I've got the tracker open in front of me, and he's polling very well. So that risk is true of any player anyone recruits. There's a chance that they turn out to be not as good as you'd hoped. But is he the right age profile and the talent profile for us? Yes. So before we really can assess whether it's a yes or no to acquiring Chad Warner, the key part here is the cost. And like I said, I think it's going to be very expensive. So going back to what I read online, there was a suggestion that West Coast, in an ideal world, would have traded pick 3 and ideally will hold 2 picks in the top 20. So how do we get those 2 picks in the top 20? Well, I do note that Sydney has 2 picks in the top 20 currently. And we potentially, hypothetically, again, we're really extrapolating here, but hypothetically, do we trade for Chad Warner and then somehow get one of their picks back to us? The other pick in the top 20 that we hold is coming from Tom Barras. So this is a little bit of a mock trade that I think could potentially get it over the line. So let's say that we get Chad Warner and Sydney's first or second pick. They've got 2 picks in a row, 18 and 19. So let's just say it's Chad Warner and pick 19 come to West Coast. West Coast hold Hawthorn's first round pick, say pick 14, pick 15, and pick 19 from Sydney. And we get our 2 picks in the top 20 while sacrificing our position in the top 3 of this year's draft. Sydney receive probably our 2 first rounders. And that is probably what it's going to cost, particularly considering we're getting a top 20 pick back, pick 3 and a future first next year. That is a steep price. But Sydney hold all the power here. And again, this is a hypothetical situation. We don't even know how serious this is. But to make this work, we will have to make it worth Sydney's while. They do hold the power here. Would you trade pick 3 and a future first to get Chad Warner and pick 19? So what we're really talking about here is a slide from pick 3 to pick 19 in this year's draft. Obviously, that's a steep price to pay. But our biggest needs right now are midfielders and ideally somebody who can improve the team now. So pick 3 becomes pick 19 in this year's draft and a future first round pick. It is hard to quantify what that will be. Now, I've been thinking maybe it's just a little bit of off-season negativity and maybe I'll change my mind as we get closer to the season, but I feel like bottom 2 or 3 is very likely for us in 2025. Now that could change if we get Chad Warner and Liam Baker or something like that. But obviously the opportunity cost is in the scenario where we don't have Chad Warner, we probably finish bottom 3 in my personal opinion. So we're talking about 2 top 3 picks here. That is a very expensive trade. And we'd be getting a young player entering his prime, but we do lose access to 2 top 5 picks that could potentially help the midfield. Now, Chad Warner is a proven quantity, but like any draft pick, there is less risk because you know he can do it at AFL level. But top 5 picks, even pick 1, comes with probably more of a comparative degree of risk. So what are the other benefits here for West Coast and getting Chad Warner? Well, firstly, I think there is something to be said for trying to lift ourselves from being this terrible, uncompetitive team for, 20 out of the 24 games we played this year, maybe 19. You could argue that improving us as a team in the short term, even if it comes at a steep cost, does have some developmental benefits. But I do think there's also a very real benefit here that we can't overlook. It's really around Harley Reid. First of all, we as a team, as a club, need to convince Harley Reid that this is a good place to stay and potentially have some success in the future. And I think that case becomes a lot stronger if you have Chad Warner, who's only a few years older, who is able to not only support Harley in the midfield. As an aside note, I'm a little bit concerned of our midfield rotation next year. If Harley Reid is our number 3 midfielder, the attention he's going to get, particularly if Tim Kelly or Elliot Yeo miss periods of football, our midfield rotation is so weak on paper. Adding Chad Warner improves that. It takes a lot of heat off Harley. It means we have multiple ways where we can get on top in a midfield battle. And it also gives Harley some belief that there are some bloody good footballers around him. And Chad Warner is a bloody good footballer. Then there's probably the more cynical view. And I saw West Coast turned a loss this year. We've generally been the most profitable club in the league, and I'm not too sure exactly what it was that went into all the losses. I mean, our home ground attendance, was fairly solid. I think spending in the soft cap and I think investment into the academies and perhaps the AFLW team all goes into that. But perhaps there is this view at West Coast of also trying to want to win games, build some optimism, and essentially make more money. That is a cynical view, but it probably does go into the motivation of West Coast here to try and improve quickly. Honestly, to my mind, I think in this hypothetical world where Chad Warner actually wants to come play for us, I think we do it. I've made a heap of content about some of the teams that have rebuilt over the years and how top 5 picks really aren't the biggest variable in a team rebuilding successfully. You look at the Hawthorn group now, and a lot of that team is built around, first of all, culture. Second of all, a really strong game plan. You could probably flip those, but they're both really important. And they've recruited a lot of role players from cheap trades and late draft picks. They've got good leaders. They've got players who are very committed. And it is very, very deficient of top 5 picks, that team. I've done a whole video on it. Will Day is probably their best draft pick, and they drafted him in a year where they finished 9th. My point being here is, yes, we should keep these top picks as sacrosanct, but I do think that the benefit that Chad Warner will have to us of keeping Harley Reid, protecting Harley Reid, increasing his longevity. Now, the club is bigger than, having a recruiting strategy around retaining one player. I know that sounds absurd, but I do think Harley is such a key part of this team. And if you go back to this tier maker I did last week, a deep West Coast Eagles analysis, I had a group there and it was top end core, and then I had supporting talents, and you look at it and we still really need to add pieces to that top end core, and I'd love them to be midfielders. Now, Chad Warner slots right in at the top among Harley Reid, Oscar Allen, and Jake Waterman as players that will be part of this team going forward. So I guess all in all, I acknowledge that it's a huge price to pay, bearing in mind that pick 3 and pick 19 in this year's draft may or may not be the biggest gap in talent. And you also have to bear in mind, sometimes at the pointy end of the drafts, West Coast are probably doing their due diligence, and maybe, I'm not saying I know this to be true, it's just something to consider. But in 2022, from what has come out since, West Coast was canvassing a lot of the top 10 and they found that there was about 3 or 4 players that were viable options for West Coast to recruit because they were willing to leave Victoria. Maybe we're looking at the top prospects in this year's draft and thinking, well, the ones we want don't want to leave Victoria, and the ones that probably would leave Victoria are probably not quite the right level talent for us. So it becomes a big decision. And the trade that I've listed there is more expensive than the Tim Kelly deal, but he's significantly younger. And the risk of us misreading where we're at is virtually zero. The biggest risk is that he just doesn't come good. But the flow-on effect of getting Chad Warner to support Harley Reid and potentially us improving as a football club will also make it easier to continue to recruit players. We did trade in a fair bit of our 2018 Premiership team. Hawthorn has done a whole stack of trading in current times. Geelong have stayed in contention in perpetuity by their ability to attract players. I must say, at this current point in time, unless you guys are going to talk me out in the comment section, I think in an ideal world we get this done. So a midfield set of Harley Reid, Chad Warner, supported by Elliot Yeo and Tim Kelly, who are aging but still can be good on their day. A little bit of Elijah Hewitt in there, maybe even Liam Baker. Do we get him as well? I suppose that's still possible. The team becomes a lot better. How much does it improve the team? I think a fair bit. We still have a long way to go. It certainly doesn't make us a premiership contender. It probably doesn't even make us a finals contender, but I think I like this. And I think I'm now going for Sydney in the grand final. Let me know in the comments what you think, guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.